My name is George Galloway, presenter of Kali Mahorra on Al Mayadeen television. Mind you, I don't mince my words. I speak Kali Mahorra, and my audience does too. Kali Mahorra, free word, free for me, free for you. Catch it. Nice to meet you, fella. Welcome to Kali Mahorra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but discussing Latin America. From Mexico in the center of Central America, right down to the tip of Chile, the map is turning pink and the Brazilian election is still to come. Is it pink? Is it red? Well, we'll discuss what all of that means. But the weather vane has well and truly turned when Colombia returns a former guerrilla as its new president. And Washington welcomes the election of the new president more or less warmly. Is this a sign of the pink tide, or is it a sign that perhaps it's not as pink as some would like to describe it as? I have been involved with Latin America for so long, I've seen the map turn shades of red and pink and be reversed many, many times. The question is, though, with the increasing dependence on trade with China throughout Latin America, every Latin American country has China as its main trading partner, with Russia and China beginning military cooperation. For example, with Nicaragua beleaguered, besieged by the United States, a potential rerun of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 80 years ago nearly now. Let me say that again because that's definitely not true. A replay of the Cuban-America-Russian crisis of 60 years ago or more is a distinct possibility, not least because US hostility towards Cuba shows no sign of declining. Are these irreversible changes? Is the Washington, D.C. government accommodating itself to them or merely biding its time before it can topple some of these governments and put this process into reverse? Why does all of this matter? Well, many people watching this program will have relatives in Latin America. Millions of people from the Arab world emigrated to or have become the families of those who did throughout Latin America. But secondly, what happens in Latin America, Monroe described it as the US's backyard, is obviously of geopolitical importance. And if there are new relationships being formed between, for example, Venezuela and Iran, between Nicaragua and Russia and China, and if the relationship between Russia and Cuba is to intensify rather than weaken, that obviously is of importance in the great geopolitical game that we try to follow here on Kali Mahorra. What do I know? I'm just the enthusiastic amateur. I'm surrounded, as always, by a panel of distinguished experts, and we better hear from them. No more distinguished than Dr. Francisco Dominguez, head of the research group on Latin America at Middlesex University in London. Welcome back, Doctor. We turn to you always on these Latin American issues. How significant was the victory of the left in Colombia?
Very, very significant, because even if you are extremely moderate in Colombia, the powers that be, from Washington all the way to Bogota, will try to assassinate you and kill any movement that you may want to build, which has been the case in Colombia for 200 years. This is no exaggeration. And the very fact that Petro was able to create such a coalition, electoral coalition, which is quite strong in political terms as well, and defeat Uribismo, Álvaro Uribe, somebody who has a very dark connections, is an indication that the United States couldn't. The context was one where the United States has between 7 to 14 military bases in that nation. And this has been the case from before 2009, when the Defense Cooperation Agreement was signed between Uribe and George W. Bush. The level of military presence of the United States in that country is ginormous. If you were to read the context of the specifics of the Defense Cooperation Agreement, then the United States has the legal authority, because of that agreement, to actually use any facility in the country, not only military facility, any facility, not only the ones that it has in the military bases, in order to turn them into military facilities that they can use for military purposes. And the whole purpose of this was actually Venezuela, as we know. So now that Petro, before being inaugurated, he's saying that he wants to normalize relations with Venezuela, is discussing openly with President Maduro to open the border between the two nations, are clear indications that the United States doesn't like these developments, but is unable to stop them. So I think in that sense, it's excellent that it happened.
Now, is this a function of a decrease in hostility from Washington to Venezuela? Quite recently, we have seen Juan Guaido more or less disappear from the scene. I don't know what happened to the gold that they gave him. The US has lessened sanctions on the Venezuelan oil industry. So is it a function of less hostility from Washington to Caracas? Or is it, as you say, simply that they cannot stop these developments?
The hostility towards Venezuela continues to be intense, but I think the impotence of the United States is clear, particularly in the circumstances of the Ukraine war, where the United States is desperate to get oil running from Venezuela to Europe in particular, so that the price doesn't go up too much. But that doesn't prevent the United States from stopping, the winning of Petro. And it's not that he didn't try. Petro won with 51% of the vote overall. But if one were to look at the number of instances where there was information about electoral fraud, intimidation, paramilitaries mobilizing in the countryside in particular, and so on. And if you look at the country, the way they voted, excuse this figure, you have the country dominated by Petro along the edges, and in the center, which is where the paramilitaries operate, is completely on the wrong side, as it were, on the right wing. So clearly they tried everything, and nothing in Colombia happens at those levels without the United States actually agreeing to it. So this is a clear another indication that the United States was impotent. I don't want to exaggerate the point because it's still very powerful, impotent to stop Petro from winning. So this is clearly a winning for us. Now exactly what it means from now on, which is going to be the difficult task of governing, we'll have to wait and see. But the difference this time round in Colombia is they are not alone, quite the opposite.
Dr. Stephen Wilkinson, a lecturer in politics and international relations at the University of Buckingham, a long-time visitor and supporter of Cuba. I asked Dr. Francisco this question in a recent show about Chile, but let me ask you, how left is Petro? Is he Tony Blair or is he Fidel Castro?
Well, he's certainly not Tony Blair. If you were going to say that was the spectrum, then he's much more to the Fidel Castro side of the spectrum. I mean, he has a past. He was a guerrilla. I mean, he was in the M19 guerrilla group. He's actually said that he bore arms. I don't think he was involved in any, of the most severe violence that was perpetrated in that struggle. But He certainly was in the armed insurgency. And he has a very strong pedigree of left politics. He was mayor of Bogota, for example, and you know, he has a profound program of wishing to bring about social change, principally healthcare, access for the poor, education for the poor, and so on. So he comes in certainly a left-wing, from a left-wing background, and I think of all the recent left-wing leaders that have attained power, he's probably the one with the most left-wing pedigree, if you like. The problem that he has, of course, is that he has a narrow majority, although I agree absolutely there was voter suppression. I mean, his support is greater than that number in the population, for sure. Although his majority, you know, in terms of the electoral result, is narrow, and he doesn't have control of Congress. So he doesn't have the legislature. So he's going to find it difficult to make significant changes, and that could be a problem because obviously those who support him want change. And one of the things that I would add to what you said, which I don't disagree with in the slightest, is, of course, you've got to think about the context under which this has taken place. We've had the pandemic, but during the pandemic in 2021, Colombia had the biggest uprising of popular dissent since the Bogotazo in the 1940s.
1948.
48, yeah. So you had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people on the streets and the most virulent, violent suppression of the protests by the security forces. So you have a situation in which the people have rejected the status quo. I mean, they weren't put down. The protests went on and on and on. And so you've got a situation, and this is why I think the United States is impotent, that the population is actually activated. And when you get that kind of mass activation in Latin American politics, it is kind of unstoppable, which means that they really had no choice but to allow this man to become president, really.
Victor Fraga, you're a celebrated Brazilian filmmaker, expert on Latin America as a whole. Do you see this as a subcontinental tide, or are these very country-specific developments?
Well, Brazil in itself is a continent. We must remember that both in terms of population and territory, Brazil is more or less equal the rest of South America. So, and Brazil often begs to differ. Right now, we only have, if I'm not mistaken, 2 right-wing governments in South America and perhaps all of Latin America, and that's Ecuador and Brazil. So I'd like to think that, yes, this is going to happen. But we have a figure in Brazil who is far more toxic than Uribe. His name is Bolsonaro, as we're all aware of. And Bolsonaro will not accept defeat. There is very little doubt as to whether Lula will win elections. We hope he will win it in the first round. The question is not whether he wins the elections. The questions are, number one, whether he will be alive until then. There's a real threat to his life. There has been violence in Brazil. Not long ago, a prominent member of the Workers' Party was assassinated on his 50th birthday, and Bolsonaro celebrated the murder of a member of the Workers' Party. Bolsonaro will not accept defeat in the way the Colombians or the Chileans even have. I was pleasantly surprised when, as his name, Cast in Chile, how graciously, at least for a far-right leader, how he accepted defeat. It's not going to be that simple in Brazil. Bolsonaro is literally arming not just the police and the military. He has a lot of support in the military. It's not unanimous in any way. The military is divided. He has very little support in the political establishment, in the justice system, and amongst the population, bar 20-25% of the people who have become completely radicalized. However, he has the military, who have arms. He has the police, who have arms, and he has relaxed gun laws in order to arm the population. So we're talking about 20-25% of the population who are rabid fascists. When I was growing up, gay people used to come out of the closet. Nowadays, it's fascists who come out of the closet, and so many fascists so many people that I know, friends and family, turn out to be rabid Bolsonaro supporters. And these people could literally bear arms, and that's what Bolsonaro wants. He's arguing from the start that the elections will not be fair, that there could be frauds. Elections in Brazil have been fully digitalized for several decades, and they are a role model for the world. There has never been any evidence of fraud whatsoever. Bolsonaro has never questioned that throughout his career. He was a member of parliament prior to becoming president for nearly 3 decades, and he never questioned that. But now he's questioning it, and he says he wants the military to check the votes. He wants to instill fear so that he can stage a self-coup. In other words, a coup to perpetuate yourself in power. You're already in power, you stage an autogolpe or a self-coup, if you like. Similarly to what Trump attempted. Trump was...
That's what I was thinking while you were talking. January 6th, perhaps,
yes.
Beckons, but
yeah.
Perhaps a more dangerous one.
Yeah, far more dangerous, because the democratic institutions in Brazil are far more fragile than the ones in the US. So Bolsonaro is very optimistic that he will succeed. There is no question as to whether he will attempt that. So we're optimistic in Brazil because we have most of the political establishment, we have the people on our side, and we also have the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court have played an instrumental role in stopping Bolsonaro, and the Supreme Court has a history of supporting coup d'etats. They supported every coup d'etat throughout the 20th century. So now having them on our side, on the side of democracy, is quite refreshing. So we are optimistic, but we are also scared, because we have reason on our side, they have the guns on their side.
Well, that's a sobering overview. Thanks for it. Dr. Guardiola Rivera is a Colombian-born professor of politics and human rights at the University of London, Birkbeck College, and he joins us now. Thank you, Dr. Guardiola Rivera.
It's a real pleasure to be here with you.
Until this election, no leftist candidate had even made it into the second round of Colombian presidential elections. What happened this time round?
On the one hand, it is the case that we have had leftist leaning candidates coming close to the presidency, or at least occupying important offices in the country, most famously Jorge Eliezer Gaitán in 1948. And in the late 1980s, after the movement that Gustavo Petro belonged to, the guerrilla movement known as M19, left on a struggle, it won a considerable number of seats, indeed a majority, in the Constitutional Convention that changed Colombia's constitution in 1991. But it is true that no leftists had, in the 214 years of Republican life, made it to the second round, let alone the presidency of Colombia. What changed this time? What changed is very well demonstrated by the protests, the general strike that took place in Colombia in between 2019 and 2021. These protests had as their epicenter not the capital or the center of the country, but rather its so-called peripheries. And it is not a coincidence that Gustavo Petro was elected with the votes of precisely those areas: the Atlantic and Pacific coast, the southeast and the southwest of the country.
Can we consider this the beginning of a new and positive chapter, not just in Colombia, but in the whole region?
That is clearly the case. We are on the verge of what one could call the pink wave 2.0. Our viewers will remember that during the first decade of the 21st century, many of the countries of Latin America moved leftwards, most famously Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, but most importantly Brazil under Lula da Silva, Argentina, Uruguay, and others. Now we are witnessing something very similar. Just as the protests that I referred to before were part of a sequence of continental protests that took place also in countries like Chile, Mexico, Brazil, and even in the United States, it is the case that Mr. Petro's victory is also part of a sequence. It is preceded by the victory of Mr. Boric in Chile. And this is important because both Chile and Colombia have been the most conservative countries. Indeed, neither of these two countries were part of the first pink wave.
In your opinion, can we expect Brazil now to take the same direction as Mexico, Peru, Chile, and now Colombia?
All the polls indicate that that will be the case. But of course, it will be the case if the threats against the threats and challenges faced by the Workers' Party and its allies in Brazil do not come in the way. It is also the case that this new left is more pragmatic. It is more interested in delivering to its voters. It is more interested in delivering for the economy and improving the cost of life and livelihood of its constituents than it is on playing with geopolitical rhetoric. That, I think, will be an advantage, and we will see that in Brazil, if and when Lula wins, as we will in Colombia and as we have seen in Mexico.
Dr. Francisco, how, I suppose, unsettled were you by Victor's take on Brazil, how precarious it is?
I'm worried about Brazil in that sense, but I doubt whether Bolsonaro will be able to succeed. I mean, this is my own take at this particular point in time. What he seems to be trying to do, I think he's made it very explicit. He has unleashed a wave of violence throughout the nation, which involves serious violence. I mean, a couple of bombs have exploded in a mass rally, for example, where Lula was present at. And as a consequence of that, he's wearing a bulletproof vest from there on. That is to say, his campaign managers fear for his life. One solution from the point of view of the Bolsonaristas will be to bump him off. And there is nobody else like Lula in Brazil at this particular time that could replace and carry the thing forward. That's number one. Number two, the idea is to create such a chaotic situation in the whole country so that he will have the excuse to suspend the elections. That's the plan. Nevertheless, the problem is he needs to implement these with some legitimacy. That is to say, he has to resort to Congress in order to implement such a thing. Because if he's going to do legitimately, that is to say, he's going to suspend the election, he'll require a positive vote in Congress and the Senate. I think there is no possibility that he can get that at all. The second thing that he will need would be some legitimacy from the Supreme Court. That is to say that they say this will be legal, constitutional, and so on. And there is no chance of that either. And the third thing is that he will have to get the armed forces completely rally behind him, and this is not the case at all.
Perfectly poised. We'll be right back after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalimahora with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but discussing Latin America. Our next guest, Gearoid O Loingsigh, is Irish but lived in Colombia for 20 years. He's especially interested in the environment, climate change, human rights, and international relations, an author and commentator of note. Doctor, welcome to the show.
Okay, thank you.
Is this victory of Gustavo Petro, a former guerrilla leader, an exception or part of a trend?
Well, it's not so much that it's an exception in Latin America. There have been other former guerrillas elected, for example, in Uruguay, Pepe Mujica. But the Petro's election in Colombia certainly has changed the political landscape, not as much as commentators think, but he has changed the political landscape, and it is quite exceptional in Colombian terms that someone like him would become president.
Peru, Chile, Mexico, now Colombia. Could Brazil go the same way in your view?
Well, Brazil has already had left-wing governments, formerly left-wing governments with Dilma Rousseff and Lula. And all indications are that he will win the elections again. But, you know, we keep talking about left-wing governments, and there are two phases in this, really. There's the previous period when we had this wave of sort of progressive governments in Latin America. Now this new wave, and their claims to be left-wing are very much questionable. You know, for example, Boric came out and he has supported the war in Ukraine. He didn't release all of the political prisoners. Most of the political prisoners that he released were under house arrest. They weren't in the jails. So, you know, we've had these left-wing governments who seem to be very much business as usual, with better management of the state, better management of capitalism in many ways. And that's probably what we're going to get in Colombia, is a state that is managed better, but is not necessarily very left-wing at all. In fact, the choices of ministers that Petro has made indicate that this will be a government very, very similar to the governments that ruled in the 1990s, the right-wing governments of the 1990s.
Gearoid, you've been living in Colombia for many, many years. In your experience, is the new president a leftist as the media are portraying him?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is you have to remember that Petro comes from the M19 guerrillas. At the time when it was founded, there were a whole range of guerrilla organizations, not just the ones that later became very famous internationally, like the FARC and the ELN. There was a whole range of them. And M19 stood out for being the only one that didn't describe itself as socialist or Marxist in any sense. They described themselves as being nationalist, and their program was always a liberal program for democratic reforms, etc. So much so that when they demobilized, their big demand, which they got, was a new constitution. The Colombia's constitution dates from that negotiation process. But in terms of economic program, Petro's minister for finance, Ocampo, was the Minister for Agriculture under Cesar Gaviria, and this is the president that introduced all of the neoliberal reforms. And he was also the Minister for Finance under Samper, the second neoliberal government in Colombia. So when we talk about a left-wing government, no, but there are, the vice president is actually far more interesting a character than he is, far more interesting because she comes from the social movements. She's a Black woman. That's actually much more exceptional in terms of Colombian politics than Petro being elected. And, you know, there are expectations on this government from the social movement that are not going to be met. Petro's victory speech was very, very clear. He said, we are going to develop capitalism in Colombia, that they're going to reduce the fiscal deficit, that they were going to stick within the neoliberal institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, and meet all of their obligations with these institutions. And he has also said that one of the areas of hope for some people is that he says he wants to renegotiate the free trade agreements, but I don't see that actually happening. There are other progressive measures that he has already stated he will do. He is going to ban fracking. It is almost certain that he will be able to do that. And his minister clearly wants to do that. And he will have some reform of the health system, but not as profound a reform as many people would like.
Now, one of his main campaign platforms was to lead the climate change initiatives. You might say that events in the world have made that more difficult than it was. Colombia is a fossil fuel producing and exporting power at a time when there's greater demand for that output. Will he be able to deliver his green agenda?
Well, many of his election promises were, like many election campaigns around the world, they were sufficiently vague to inspire people and not to be held to the details later. With exceptions, for example, he was very clear about the energy transition away from petrol. But, you know, in some ways, he doesn't get to decide that. You know, the world economy gets to decide that. Colombia is moving away from coal. The largest coal mines in Latin America are in Colombia. And the idea was to move away from that. But now, with the crisis in Ukraine, we suddenly see Germany and other countries saying they're going to go back to coal. Colombia is going to continue exporting it because there is an actual reality that he needs foreign capital in the country. He needs the sale of the oil and of the coal and other things. So in 4 years, no, he's not going to do it in 4 years. And I think he has been realistic enough himself. His actual proposal was, I think, for a 10-year period of a transition away from oil, which he may do some of, and he may limit exploration in certain environmentally fragile areas of the country. You know, there will be some improvement, but I don't see that. You know, I don't see huge steps being made. And he has the problem that Petro wants to be all things to all people. So he has commitments to Colombia's ruling class, and he has commitments to the social movements. And some of them are contradictory, very contradictory. So it remains to be seen who will win out. But like I say, the fracking, it's very, very simple for him to ban fracking. And I think he will do that. It'll be one of his first measures as president.
Not the best time to be embarking on a green revolution, you might say, in terms of the international field. But turning to the bigger picture, Dr. Wilkinson, for you and me even longer, as I'm older, the one constant has been Cuba. The one lighthouse that has never dimmed has been Cuba. How are these developments across Latin America viewed from Havana?
Well, the Cuban government is very happy with these developments, obviously, because it's bringing to power people who are less inclined to oppose them, if not people who are outspokenly in support of them. I mean, no one's mentioned Mexico, and we have at the present moment a very outspoken left-wing leader in Mexico, also an exceptional case, really, in the case of Mexico, who, is taking the debate publicly all the time in favor of changing U.S. policy towards Cuba. AMLO.
And even Assange, he's outspoken, he's offering Julian Assange asylum in Mexico.
Indeed, and even, as suggested that if they don't free Assange, the French should take the Statue of Liberty back. I mean, I think there are two things I would say in answer to that gentleman there, who was actually, I think, very accurate in what he was saying. That you can't divorce any of this from two contexts. One, the geopolitical context, which of course impinges because of fuel. Incidentally, Cuba at the moment is suffering greatly because of the fuel situation.
The Russian oil has just arrived, hundreds of thousands of barrels.
One hopes that it will be alleviated, but it has been difficult the last few weeks. But the other thing is, you can't divorce it also from this is the historic situation in Latin America, and he mentioned class, the ruling class. That you have a situation to generalize, obviously dangerous thing to do, but in almost all Latin American countries, you have this mass of poverty-stricken, generally population, and a very small, very, very highly wealthy oligarchical ruling class. And this has been the case that when the mass is mobilized, the ruling class has to kind of accept the fact that they've got to let that voice be heard for a while, because otherwise it could unleash a problem that'd be too big for them to handle. And that's the situation which has arisen in Colombia. And the fact that a vice president has been elected who is a black woman, a single mother as well, who has, comes actually from the working class, and of course it is a racialized situation in these countries. This is symbolic, a very profoundly symbolic thing. Now, the situation in Colombia could go both ways, and that's the situation. As in Brazil, I think you'd agree, it could go two ways. Either a coup and horrific repression, or actually a revolutionary situation could arise. Now, in that context, of course, Cuba remains a beacon, because this situation arose in Cuba in the 1940s and 50s and resulted in a revolution. And the radicalization of the process is always possible, and that's something that we really have to take into account.
Victor, which of that dichotomy is likely to play out in your view? I must say I'm with Dr. Francisco. I don't believe that Bolsonaro has the strength, either institutional nor amongst the people, to bring about this auto coup that you refer to. But let's say I'm right for a minute and Lula becomes president again. It's back to my earlier question. What Lula? Which Lula? The Lula I lent $200 to in 1985, who was a bristling revolutionary, or the Lula that's picking running mates and sending signals that actually the ruling class don't have as much to fear as they think, and that Washington doesn't have as much to fear as they think.
You've nailed it. There are two Lulas. There is the trade unionist from the 1980s, feared by the US, feared by the ruling class, and there was the Lula that was elected in 2002, which we called Lula Paz y Amor, Lula Love and Peace, who is a far more digestible version of Lula, who has established a dialogue with the market and who has established a relationship with what we call the Centrão in Brazil. In Brazil, we have a huge problem. The left is far from having a majority in either one of in the lower and in the upper house, Senate and Congress. And this is not within reach. And we have what we call Centrão. Centrão means a big center, but this does not refer to the political spectrum. They're not centrists. They are trade horsing parties. They are parties that will align themselves with whoever is in power. So Lula and Dilma, in order to govern, they had to align themselves with the Centrão. They would not be able to govern with 20 or 25% of members of parliament. So we're not going to see, I'm very sorry to say, and I'll politely disagree with you on that, I don't think we're going to see a left-wing revolution in Brazil. Lula's running mate is a very vivid example of that. Lula picked Gearoid O Loingsigh as his running mate. Gearoid O Loingsigh is Lula's former foe. He was defeated by both Dilma and Lula previously in the presidential elections, running in the PSDB, the right-wing party. He has now moved away. He has become, once again, more digestible, but in the other direction. He has become more left-wing. So Gearoid O Loingsigh joined a left-wing party and he's campaigning with Lula, and it's very funny to see a former right-wing candidate mingling with the people, with the working class. It's a very, very strange hybrid picture, which I'm still struggling to accept. But anyway, he's there. So if Lula is elected and gets killed, it will be Gearoid O Loingsigh who takes over. Gearoid O Loingsigh is by no means Bolsonaro. He is a far more moderate man, but he's in a left-wing party, but he's by no means a left-wing politician. So we're going to see a Lula that is far more flexible, that is going to establish a dialogue with the trade industry, a Lula that we're not going to see, if we're talking once again about a very, very wide spectrum with Tony Blair, Fidel Castro, we're neither going to see a Fidel Castro nor a Tony Blair. I think we're going to see something bang in the middle, someone who is, and it will be a huge relief because the situation in Brazil is so tragic right now, and the real possibility of a military coup is so scary that a moderate Lula is a much, 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 much more welcome solution.
I know that you know this, but for the avoidance of doubt, it's not my business what internal domestic policies any Latin American government follows. It is my interest what their international role is, what their relationship to American imperial power is. And so I raise the issue of this spectrum only in that regard. Whatever way it breaks, Dr. Francisco, this is a long way from the grim generalissimos that governed most of Latin America during our lifetime. So whether pink or red, we've come quite a long way.
Absolutely. I think without ignoring the complexities of every single case, you name a country, you have a lot of complexities. The movement overall of the region is absolutely in the right direction, but it's not only in the right direction, but it's solid. I think that's what matters. We've seen this when you are a small Latin American countries, you could be 10 million, 20 million, 30 million inhabitants. When you have to confront publicly in a summit, the United States, the boss, and you tell them what you think publicly, such as happened in the Summit of the Americas, that is a clear indication that things are changing quite dramatically. There are many things that can be said about the Summit of the Americas in this regard, but I concentrate only on two. Number one, the whole region revolted at the exclusion of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. And if Cuba had difficulties in finding allies in the region because of ideological factors, on this particular occasion, you know, the Cubans were absolutely delighted because the whole nation, the whole continent, including right-wing governments such as Bukele in El Salvador and such as the president of Guatemala, who is very right-wing, they're all absolutely furious at the exclusion. So that's number one. Number two, the person who actually was, many presidents refused to go. López Obrador refused to go. Luis Arce from Bolivia refused to go, and several other presidents refused to go in protest at this. But they entrusted Alberto Fernandez, president of Argentina, to express their views regarding this exclusion. And he did two things. I mean, the speech is a bit longer than that, but I'll concentrate on the two key ones. He said, number one, this is completely unacceptable. Times have changed. It's not going to happen again. In other words, he intimated that if there was another summit, they will not come at all. So the relationship where the United States, the boss, is in a position to, you know, sort of organize them, will come to an end, which will be a big blow for the United States in terms of his influence, you know, publicly in the region. And the second thing he said the Organization of American States must be immediately reformed. More or less, he called for its closure. And he said the people in charge of the Organization of American States, Luis Almagro particularly, you know, he didn't name it, but everybody knew that he meant him, must be immediately removed and sacked, and the whole structure that is running this thing must be completely changed. And the emphasis now in Latin America is on the Commonwealth of Latin American and Caribbean States, which is CELAC. And they already invited China at their meeting to fight poverty. And their relationship, they're going to have a privileged relationship with China and others in Eurasia, as they call it now. They used to call it Asia, now it's Eurasia. What they mean by that Eurasia is Russia. There is no question about it. And there are huge number of plans that, you know, are going to produce all sorts of results. So that's the second important dimension of the region moving in the right direction. And the third dimension is this. The United States is in no position to offer anything at all. Even if he wanted to, it can't. It's not that he wants to, he doesn't want to, but if he did have the wherewithal to actually offer something, he wouldn't. All he offers is pillage, brutality, repression, and military bases, and austerity packages, which is, they're not attractive. So as a consequence of this, which has been going on for some years now, any temporary victory of the right wing, including the possibility, unlikely possibility of a coup in Brazil, they cannot consolidate it. And that's why the line of movement is in the right direction. And all of them, now with Mexico added to the melting pot, as it were, in terms of the left moving together, now they all have the experience of what they could do when they are in power. You just look at the figures of economic growth in Bolivia. It's over 5% on average for the last 10 years. If you look at the rates of economic growth in Nicaragua, again, it's 4.6, 4.7. In other words, the moment you become right-wing and associate yourself with the United States and the European Union, the standard of living of the population immediately collapses. So therefore, there is only one conclusion that they have drawn. Whether they are revolutionary Marxists or whether they are not revolutionary Marxists, they have to get things right.
I don't know about you, but that all cheered me up. I like to send you off to your bed happy. If only it were happening in the Arab world, but that's another question. I've been George Galloway, and you have been a marvellous audience. Thanks for joining us.